of liberty. Now, there are 3 points I would want to make about these speeches. The first is that there is a kind of shift, as you will see, from the idea that freedom and liberty are distinctively American values to the idea that they are distinctively human, universal values, to the idea that they are natural values, to the idea that they are part of God's intelligent design for the world. That shift, I think, has its own dynamic and its own significance. But the second point I would want to make about it is this. It's very hard to take that rhetoric about liberty and freedom and then look at the pictures from Abu Ghraib, look at what's happening in Guantanamo Bay, look at what is being done through the Patriot Act, look at the circumscription of liberties which are going on, look at the way in which the United States is in alliance with states like Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, many other places where these notions of freedom and liberty are completely ignored. So there is, if you like, a tremendous gap between the rhetoric and the actuality. And there's a temptation, I think, on many people's parts, as a result of this, to take Bush's rhetoric about liberty and freedom and treat it as if it's just hot air, it's just hypocritical nonsense, and therefore not worth discussing. On that point, I find myself partially in agreement with the conservative columnist in the New York Times, David Brooks, who was commenting on one of his speeches about liberty and freedom, who kind of went on to say this. We should not assume, he says, that the real America is the money-grubbing, resource-wasting, TV-drenched, unreflective bimbo of the earth, and that all this high-toned language is just a cover for the quest for oil or the desire for riches, dominion, or war. Now, I think actually America is all of those things. But I think Brooks is quite right to insist that this rhetoric is not just a cover. It actually is serious, and it has serious echoes, and part of the politics of this country, I think, comes out of the history of those concepts. And I think the way that Bush referred back to Woodrow Wilson, to Roosevelt, to Reagan, sometimes he refers back to Kennedy as well, suggests that what Bush is engaged in here is not something that's an aberration. And I think one of the problems many of us have these days is we think that Bush is an aberration, when I think that in some ways he's deeply, deeply representative of the American historical tradition. And in particular, he recites again and again Woodrow Wilson. And I think this harking back to Woodrow Wilson is important and significant. For instance, in his Whitehall speech, which he gave to the British, he made much of the fact that he was the first president to sleep in Buckingham Palace since Woodrow Wilson. And he talked about Woodrow Wilson, an idealist, without question, he said, and he recounted that at a dinner hosted by King George V, Woodrow Wilson made a pledge, and this is Bush speaking. With typical American understatement, he vowed that right and justice would become the predominant and controlling force in the world. He then went on to say that right and justice, which Americans took very seriously, had a long and honorable tradition. And he even made a sort of joking remark that he said, if we Americans are too concerned about freedom and liberty, it is because we have read too much John Locke and Adam Smith. Of course, it boggles the mind a little bit to imagine George Bush reading John Locke and Adam Smith, but you see what he's getting at, which is that there is a long tradition of this way of thinking, and he's situating himself against that background. And I think the Woodrow Wilson argument is significant, because Woodrow Wilson made a following speech in 1919. He said this: since trade ignores national boundaries and the manufacturer insists on having the world as a market, the flag of his nation must follow him, and the doors of the nation which are closed against him must be battered down. Concessions obtained by financiers must be safeguarded by ministers of state, i.e., particularly the military, even if the sovereignty of unwilling nations be outraged in the process. This is rather an astonishing statement, and you could take that statement and put it right full square with the invasion of Iraq. Because this, when we follow it up, what Woodrow Wilson then said was, colonies must be obtained or planted in order that no useful corner of the world may be overlooked or left unused. Now, this aspect of the American tradition, I think, and it's a continuity in, if you like, the American imperial tradition, which Woodrow Wilson was crucial in identifying and which continues to this present day, that this tradition is something which needs, I think, to be addressed and looked at very much more seriously. But then there's another third issue here. And the third issue is, well, what does Bush actually mean by freedom? It's a wonderful word, but as Matthew Arnold said of it a long time ago, he said, freedom is a great horse to ride, but you've got to know your destination. So what is the destination of this freedom which Bush is concerned to confer upon the rest of the world? I think that became most clear in Iraq, when in September of 2003, Paul Bremer, head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, imposed a new institutional structure of government in Iraq. And the institutional structure became more and more complex over the following 9 months until the Provisional Authority handed over power to an interim government. But basically, the basic four elements in this institutional structure were, first, that there should be privatization of all assets. Private ownership should predominate. Secondly, there should be no barriers to foreign investment coming into the country. There should be no barriers to the repatriation of profits out of the country. There should be absolutely no barriers to foreign trade. And the only issue that was actually, interestingly, kept in place from the Saddam era was the control over labour. That labour unionisation was to be curtailed and strictly regulated. So that what was being imposed upon Iraq was a certain state institutional structure. And later on, as I say, it was elaborated into all kinds of things, that there would be total respect in Iraq for intellectual property rights, that Iraq would subscribe to all of the conditions of the WTO, that Iraq would, would set up a legal structure which would be sort of a favour to private property. And The Economist at the time, reviewing what Bremer did, said, this is a capitalist paradise which is being legislated here. So this is, in a sense, what is meant by freedom. And actually, if you go back into Bush's speeches, you will find, not often, but enough times, he says, what I mean by freedom is freedom of the market and free trade. That's what I mean. And sometimes he talks about human rights and private property and the like, but it's basically free markets and free trade. Now, the interesting thing about this institutional arrangement that was arrived at in Iraq and imposed upon Iraq by military force was there was a certain parallel with something that had occurred 30 years before in Chile on what the Chileans call their little September the 11th, which was September the 11th, 1973, when a socialist Prime Minister, Salvador Allende, was overthrown and killed in a coup by General Pinochet. Shortly after General Pinochet took power, what General Pinochet did, having destroyed, of course, the labour movement, all of the left-wing parties, and all of those centres of opposition in things like the community health centres in poor neighbourhoods and all the rest of it, destroying all that infrastructure, having destroyed all of that, the question was, what kind of economy would you construct in Chile? And the answer came out a couple of years later when Pinochet called upon a group of economists, Chilean economists, who had been trained in the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman. And these economists mandated the economy be reconstructed on exactly the same lines as happened to Iraq 30 years later. That is, privatize everything, have free open trade, foreign direct investment was welcome, no barriers to repatriation of profits, export-led development model and all the rest of it. And I think that period, which starts with the coup in Chile and the experimental utilization of the Chicago neoliberal program, and Iraq brackets, if you like, a whole history of neoliberal transformation of the global economy.